we're exploring the question, who exactly served the longest as the Senate President of the Philippines?
Right, and it's such a fascinating problem of, like, political physics, you know?
Oh, how do you mean?
Well, we tend to assume that institutional impact requires decades of this slow, methodical grinding. But when you look at the raw data from our sources today, the correlation between time spent in power and the actual weight of a leader's legacy is incredibly unpredictable.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a definitive look at the 26 leaders who have served as the Senate President. Our sources rank them strictly by their total time in office.
Yeah, from the absolute longest to the very shortest.
And we want to explore that specific mechanism you mentioned. How does the length of a leader's service actually translate into legislative power? Because, I mean, the Senate President doesn't just sit at the front of the room and bang a gavel, right?
Oh, far from it. I mean, they are the primary protector of the chamber's independence.
Which is huge.
Right. They control the flow of the entire legislative calendar. So they decide what sees the floor and, what gets quietly buried in committee.
So they're like the ultimate gatekeeper.
Exactly. They act as this vital counterweight to the executive branch. And during national turning points, they're the ones who have to interpret and sometimes even bend parliamentary procedure just to keep the government functioning.
Okay, so let's start with the absolute titans of the institution, the leaders who held the gavel the longest.
The marathon runners.
Yeah, exactly. And if we're talking about massive spans of time, we have to start with number one, Manuel L. Quezon.
Right, the very first.
Yeah, he served for roughly 19 years, from 1916 all the way to 1935. So he is definitively the longest-serving Senate president in Philippine history.
And, 19 years is an absolute eternity in politics.
It really is.
But we have to look at the mechanism of how Quezon actually used that time.
Yeah.
Like, he was the very first Senate president leading the chamber during those formative years of self-government under American colonial rule.
So he was kind of building the plane while flying it.
Kind of, yeah. He didn't just inherit an institution. He used the Senate presidency as this wedge to pry autonomy away from Washington.
Right. The Senate, under his leadership, essentially acted as a de facto independent government in waiting.
That is the precise dynamic. His leadership wasn't just about domestic floor management, it was international leverage.
Right, like the independence missions.
Exactly. He headed the first independence mission to the U.S. Congress, which culminated in the Tidings-McDuffie Law of 1934. So his 19 years allowed him to build the institutional muscle of the Senate so effectively that it served as the natural springboard for him to become the first president of the Commonwealth.
So if Quezon is the architect who, drafted the blueprint and poured the foundation of the Philippine Senate.
I like that analogy.
Thanks. Then Eulogio A. Rodriguez Sr., who is number 2 on our list, serving around 10 to 11 years, he kind of feels like the building manager who wired the place and made sure it could withstand an earthquake.
That's a great way to look at it. Rodriguez, who is widely known as Aman and Mr. Nacionalista, held the role through the 1950s and the early 1960s.
Which was a pretty volatile time, right?
Oh, incredibly. You have to remember the context. This is the post-war democratic period. The state was super fragile.
So they just needed stability.
Yes. What Rodriguez provided was the sheer mechanical stability of party politics. His legacy wasn't necessarily, a single sweeping law. It was his ability to whip votes, enforce party discipline, and just maintain the day-to-day operations of a democracy recovering from global devastation.
You see those numbers, right? 19 years, 11 years. And my first instinct is to assume that to be a legendary Senate president, you need at least a decade.
Right. You think you need that uninterrupted block of time.
Exactly, to really build a legacy. But as we move down the list and forward in history, that pattern totally collapses. We start seeing tenures of 4 to 8 years, and they're often broken up into non-consecutive terms.
Which completely changes the dynamic.
Yeah, I'm looking at Franklin M. Drilon at number 3, who served about 8 years combined across 3 different stints, and Vicente Tito Sotto III at number 5, with almost 5 years combined, including a return in 2025.
Right.
When I see these fractured timelines, I initially assume, they just lost power, got ousted, and then had to somehow claw their way back.
It is so easy to assume that a broken timeline implies, a lack of control or instability. But the mechanism driving this is actually the exact opposite.
Really? How so?
It's way less about these leaders clawing their way back and much more about the institution pulling the emergency alarm.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, when unprecedented crises hit, the Senate reverts to its most experienced floor managers.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So the Senate treats them as, like, institutional fixers to call back in.
Exactly. Look at Drilon's background, for example. Before heading the Senate, he was Labor Secretary, Justice Secretary, and Executive Secretary.
Wow, so he knew the executive branch inside and out.
Exactly. He brought this intense executive-style discipline to the legislative branch. The Senate called him to the presidency when it specifically needed rigorous budget oversight and justice reforms.
So they needed someone who knew all the executive branch's tricks.
Precisely. They needed someone who understood exactly how the executive branch might try to bypass the legislature and could block it.
And that emergency alarm mechanism, that makes perfect sense for Sotto as well, right? He was presiding over the Senate during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the pure mechanics of lawmaking during a global lockdown. The rules of governance, public health, economic stimulus, all of it had to be rewritten in a matter of weeks.
And they couldn't even physically be in the same room.
Right. Navigating that requires a deep instinctual mastery of parliamentary procedure. You cannot have a rookie figuring out committee rules on the fly during a pandemic. The institution demands someone with decades of muscle memory.
It's crisis management on a massive national scale, which brings to mind another kind of crisis. Not a virus, but an existential threat to the institution itself.
Ah, yes.
I'm thinking about Gilje Puyat at number 4, who served for about 5 years leading up to 1972.
Puyat's tenure is a literal masterclass in institutional defense. He led the chamber in those highly sensitive years just before martial law.
So it wasn't really about passing regular bills at that point.
Not at all. It was about holding the door against executive overreach. He was actively trying to preserve the Senate's independence right up until Congress was officially abolished.
So if Puyat was the one trying to hold the door shut against authoritarianism, then Jovito Arcilonga, who is number 7 on the list, he was the one who had to pry it back open and basically rebuild the entire interior.
That is a perfect way to phrase it.
Yeah, Salonga served about 4 years as the first Senate president after the 1987 Constitution finally restored the chamber.
And the challenge there was just immense. Salonga's mandate wasn't just legislative, it was highly psychological.
What do you mean by psychological?
Well, he had to prove to a very skeptical nation that democratic institutions could actually function again without just collapsing back into corruption or gridlock.
Ah, right. Trust was totally broken.
Exactly. And his deep background in human rights advocacy gave the restored Senate this immediate aura of integrity that it desperately, desperately needed.
That brings us to another figure who managed a massive national stress test. At number 6, Juan Ponce Enrile, who served for roughly 4.5 years.
Right, a very eventful 4.5 years.
Extremely. Beyond managing the transition from the Arroyo to the Aquino administrations, his tenure is really defined by presiding over the historic 2012 impeachment trial of Chief Justice Renato Corona.
Yeah, and impeachments are the ultimate stress test of the Constitution. As Senate president during that trial, Enrile essentially became the Chief Justice of a political court.
Explain how that mechanism actually works, because I think a lot of people assume it's just, banging the gavel and calling for order.
Well, no, it's so much more intense than that. The Senate president in an impeachment trial controls what evidence is actually admissible. They manage the grueling pacing of the whole trial.
Oh, wow. So they really control the flow of everything.
Completely. They set the strict boundaries for both the prosecution and the defense. It requires this absolute, unshakable mastery of the rules of evidence and parliamentary procedure.
Because everyone is watching.
Every single ruling you make from that chair is heavily scrutinized by the entire nation and, recorded in history. Enrile's ability to maintain order during a deeply polarizing trial really showcased the immense hidden power of the Senate president's chair.
Okay, so we've looked at the marathon builders and the emergency fixers, but there's another distinct category we need to talk about. These are the leaders who served shorter terms, like 3 years, 2 years, sometimes less than a year.
Right, the transitional figures.
Yeah, and for them, the Senate presidency seems to act as this incredibly powerful intersection. It's either a stepping stone to something bigger, or it's part of a much wider, multi-branch mastery.
The stepping stone phenomenon is very real. The Senate presidency offers just unparalleled national visibility.
Right. Let's look at number 10, Ferdinand E. Marcos. He served as Senate president for about 2 years and 8 months in the early 1960s.
And he utilized that position heavily to build his national political profile and, consolidate alliances before launching his consequential and obviously deeply controversial presidency.
And Manuel L. at number 21 did something similar much earlier. He only served for about 10 months as Senate president.
Right, a very short stint.
But it was during that critical transition from the Commonwealth to the post-war era. And he used that momentum to vault into becoming the first president of the Third Republic.
But, the intersection isn't always about jumping to the executive branch. Sometimes a short term is used to push a massive amount of policy through sheer consensus building.
Like who?
Well, take Edgardo J. Angara at number 12. He served about 2 years and 7 months in the post-EDSA era.
He's a fascinating example because he proved you don't need a decade to rewrite the country's social safety net.
Precisely. Angara was a master at building coalitions. In under 3 years, he drove through these foundational landmark measures in education, health, and social welfare.
Just by getting everyone on the same page.
Right. He understood that when you have a narrow window, you don't waste time on partisan bickering. You find the exact leverage points where all factions agree and you push relentlessly.
And we see that same stabilizing energy from post-war figures too, right?
Right.
Like Jose D. Avellino at number 8 and Mariano Chiz El Cuenco at number 9, who each served around 3 years.
Right. Very solid transitional leaders.
And Naphtali A. Gonzalez at number 11, who served a combined 2.5 years later on. They weren't necessarily flashy, but they were vital in maintaining that legislative continuity.
Absolutely essential.
But here's where it gets really interesting to me. I want to look at the absolute wildest resumes on this list.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, look at number 20, Marcelo B. Fernan. He served as Senate president for only about 11 months, but he is the only person in the history of the Philippines to serve as both the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the Senate president.
It is a staggering dual achievement, and honestly, it fundamentally alters how laws are made.
Right. Because if you've spent your entire career in the judicial branch, interpreting laws and finding their constitutional limits, how does that change your approach when you suddenly cross over to the legislative branch to actually write them?
It brings this profound judicial discipline to the legislative floor. When Fernan presided over the Senate, he wasn't just overseeing the drafting of bills. He was reviewing them with the precise foresight of a judge who knows exactly how they would be attacked in court.
Oh, so he was bulletproofing the laws before they even passed.
Exactly. He forced the Senate to craft airtight legislation, which elevated the chamber's standing and really cemented its role as a truly co-equal branch of government.
That's incredible. And he's not the only one who mastered 2 different arenas. We have Manny Villar at number 13, who served for a little over 2 years. And then decades earlier, Jose C. Zulueta at number 23, who served for just 7 months.
Right, the dual chamber leaders.
Yeah, they share the incredibly rare distinction of having been both the Speaker of the House of Representatives and the Senate President.
And the political muscles required for those 2 roles are just entirely different. I mean, the House of Representatives is driven by hyper-local interests.
It's a lot more chaotic, right?
Oh, it's chaotic, it's loud, and it's all about managing sheer numbers and competing district needs. The Senate, however, has a national constituency. It's much more deliberate, the pacing is slower, and individual senators hold massive veto power.
So to master both, you have to be able to speak the language of local patronage, but then also the language of national statesmanship.
Exactly. Villar, for example, took that aggressive deal-making energy he honed in the House and translated it into a highly focused national agenda in the Senate, heavily pushing things like entrepreneurship and infrastructure.
Which brings us to the modern era and the reality of how fast the political clock ticks today. We're looking at a whole group of leaders whose terms hover around a year or 2.
And this requires us to examine why modern terms are generally shorter. It isn't necessarily a lack of leadership, It is a reflection of shifting institutional dynamics.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we operate in a highly fractured multi-party system today. Coalitions are incredibly delicate.
You spend half your time legislating and the other half just fighting off coups to keep the gavel.
Precisely. A modern Senate president must constantly renegotiate their mandate with their peers. Just look at the recent transitions. Juan Miguel Migz Zubiri, at number 14, he served roughly 1 year and 10 months focusing heavily on economic recovery, early in the Marcos Jr. era, before the coalition shifted.
And Aquilino Coco Pimentel III, at number 15, served a similar length.
Right, managing the complex transition and federalism discussions early in the Duterte administration.
You also have these sharp parliamentarians like Ernesto M. Maceda at number 16, who served a year and 3 months, utilizing the role aggressively for executive oversight, and Francis Chiz Escudero at number 17, assuming the role in 2024 for a little over a year.
You also see subject matter experts taking the helm for brief, very focused periods. Like Blas Opel at number 18 brought immense labor policy weight to his one-year term. And Arturo M. Tolentino at number 19 utilized his 1 year to project his deep constitutional law expertise. And of course, the most recent leader, Alan Peter Cayetano at number 26, whose ongoing term began in 2026. He inherently has the shortest term right now, simply because his clock just started.
Yeah, that makes sense. And even further back, you have the absolute briefest completed terms, like Quinton B. Paredes at number 24. He held the presidency for a mere month during a rapid transition.
A month is barely enough time to figure out where your office is.
Exactly. And Camilo Oacias at number 25 served very short, non-consecutive terms in the early 1950s, yet he still managed to leave a lasting mark on civic values and education. But, and this is where we really hit the climax of our deep dive, this brings me to the biggest paradox of this entire list.
Okay, let's hear it.
Ranked 22 out of 26. Aquilino Nenny Pimentel Jr., he served as Senate President for just 7 months.
7 months.
7 months. Yet despite that incredibly brief window, he is universally recognized as the principal author and driving force behind the Local Government Code of 1991. So we have to pause here.
Yeah, it's a huge point.
How does a leader fundamentally decentralize an entire national government, like shifting massive amounts of tax authority and political power down to the provinces in just 7 months?
This is exactly where we have to separate the title from the timeline. The clock of a Senate presidency is highly deceptive.
Deceptive how?
Well, those 7 months Nenny Pimentel spent holding the gavel, they don't account for the years, the decades, really, of intense politicking, drafting, and coalition building he did before he ever took the top seat.
Oh, so by the time he actually became Senate President, the foundation was already poured.
The foundation was poured, the walls were up, and the gavel was simply the final tool needed to install the roof. The local government code wasn't conceived and written in 7 months.
Right, that would be impossible.
Exactly. But Pimentel used his 7 months of maximum leverage, his control over committee assignments, his ability to dictate floor debates, his power to shut down delaying tactics, to push a monumental piece of legislation across the finish line. The title didn't give him the idea. It gave him the sheer institutional force to execute a vision he'd been fighting for his entire career.
Wow. That completely reorients how we should view this entire ranking. We started this deep dive looking at Manuel L. 19-year marathon, laying the very bricks of the legislative branch to secure independence.
Right.
We explored how the Senate pulls the emergency alarm to bring in crisis managers like Drilon and Sotto, or how Salonga had to rebuild public trust after the doors were forced open again.
Yeah, all distinctly different uses of time.
And we arrive at this profound realization that a 7-month term can reshape the country just as deeply as a 10-year term, if the leader knows exactly where to strike the hammer.
And, as we reflect on this entire spectrum, it is crucial to reiterate that our exploration of these sources is strictly mechanical and historical.
Absolutely.
We are looking at a roster that includes figures who are universally revered and figures who remain deeply, deeply polarizing across the political spectrum. Our focus here is purely on the raw data of their tenures to understand how the institution of the Senate bends, flexes, and survives the immense pressures of history.
The Senate is essentially a vessel, and these 26 individuals were the ones steering it, some for decades and some for mere days.
Which leaves us with a really compelling question for the future.
What's that?
Well, if we now know that historical impact is not strictly bound by the length of service, how will we judge the Senate presidents of tomorrow?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, we live in an era where technology accelerates every single political cycle, and global crises hit with unprecedented speed.
Well,
will future legislative legacies be built not in years or months, but by the sheer velocity of crises a leader can successfully manage in a matter of days?
It makes you wonder if time is just the canvas, but the crisis is the actual paint. We'll leave you to mull that over. When you look at the architecture of power, which type of leadership do you believe leaves the deepest mark on a nation? The marathon builder, the crisis fixer, or the short-term visionary? Keep that in mind the next time you watch the gavel fall.